some sounds you never forget. The crack of lightning that splits the night sky. The roar of jet engines screaming overhead. The sharp command that ends your military career in 3 words, pack your bags. But Sarah Martinez never expected all 3 sounds to collide on the same night, creating a moment that would transform her from a disgraced Air Force communications officer into the person who would save thousands of lives. Sometimes the worst day of your life becomes the doorway to your greatest purpose. What started as a court-martial hearing would end with Sarah standing in a control tower, holding a radio that crackled with the most important question ever asked in aviation history. A question that came not from ground control, but from somewhere 35,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, where 347 passengers and crew found themselves flying blind through the storm of the century. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same independent spirit that got her kicked off the base would be exactly what those people needed to survive the night, because when all official channels fail and the rulebook becomes useless, sometimes you need someone who's already learned how to break the rules to save lives. This is the story of how one woman's downfall became aviation's most unlikely miracle, how a single thunderclap changed everything, and how sometimes being told to leave is exactly what prepares you to come back when you're needed most. The fluorescent lights in Colonel Harrison's office buzzed like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across the mahogany desk where Sarah Martinez's military career lay dying in triplicate. 26 years old, 5 years of dedicated service, and it all came down to this moment. The manila folder marked "Disciplinary Action" seemed to glow under those unforgiving lights. Technical Sergeant Martinez, Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the sterile air like a blade. "You've left me no choice." His weathered face, marked by decades of military precision, showed no emotion. Behind him, the American flag hung motionless, a silent witness to what was about to unfold. Sarah sat ramrod straight in the uncomfortable metal chair, her dress blue uniform pressed to perfection despite knowing it might be the last time she'd wear it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, not a strand out of place, but her hands, folded neatly in her lap, trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from rage that she fought to keep contained. The charges were clear, even if the circumstances weren't black and white. Insubordination, failure to follow direct orders, unauthorized access to classified communications equipment. The words looked damning on paper, but they didn't tell the real story. They didn't explain how Sarah had intercepted a distress signal from a civilian aircraft 3 weeks ago, how she'd spent her off-duty hours trying to coordinate a rescue that the official channels had written off as a lost cause. "The families deserve to know," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her chest. "That plane went down with 12 people on board, including 3 children. The search was called off after 48 hours, but I was still picking up emergency beacon signals on frequencies that weren't being monitored." Colonel Harrison's jaw tightened. "That wasn't your decision to make, Martinez. Chain of command exists for a reason. You violated direct orders from your commanding officer." "My commanding officer was wrong," Sarah replied, lifting her chin slightly. Even now, facing the end of everything she'd worked for, she couldn't back down. It wasn't in her nature. Her mother used to say she'd been born arguing with the doctor who delivered her. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Outside, Sarah could hear the distant roar of F-16s taking off for evening training exercises. The sound that had once filled her with pride now felt like a funeral march. Colonel Harrison opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Official letterhead, official language, official ending to an unofficial calling. "By the power vested in me by the United States Air Force, I hereby initiate proceedings for your immediate discharge under less than honorable conditions." The words hit her like a physical blow, but Sarah kept her expression neutral. She'd seen this coming for weeks. Ever since she'd been caught in the communications center at 0300 hours, frantically working frequencies that had been declared off-limits, ever since she'd refused to apologize for trying to save lives. "You'll have 72 hours to clear your belongings from base housing," Harrison continued, his voice taking on the mechanical tone of someone following a script. "Your security clearance is hereby revoked, and you're barred from accessing any military installation pending final discharge proceedings." Sarah nodded once, sharply. "Understood, sir." But Harrison wasn't finished. He set the paper down and leaned forward, his official mask slipping just slightly. "Martinez, you're one of the best communication specialists I've ever worked with. Your technical skills are exceptional. Your dedication is beyond question. But you can't save everyone, and you can't do it by ignoring the rules that keep this entire operation functioning." "With respect, sir," Sarah said, standing slowly. "Sometimes the rules are wrong. Sometimes saving lives matters more than following orders. Harrison's face hardened again. Dismissed, Technical Sergeant. Or should I say, former Technical Sergeant. Sarah saluted one last time, the motion crisp and precise despite everything. Then she turned and walked out of the office, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Behind her, she heard Harrison pick up his phone to make the calls that would officially end her military career. The walk across base felt surreal. Everywhere she looked, she saw reminders of the life she was leaving behind. The communications tower, where she'd spent countless hours monitoring emergency frequencies. The barracks, where she'd formed friendships that had sustained her through deployments and difficult assignments. The flag that flew over the main gate, representing ideals she still believed in, even if the institution had failed her. Her small apartment in base housing felt hollow as she began the process of packing 5 years of her life into cardboard boxes. The commendations and certificates that had once filled her with pride now seemed like artifacts from someone else's life. The photos of her with her unit, smiling and confident in their shared purpose, hurt to look at. But it was the radio equipment in her spare bedroom that made her pause. Not military issue, but her own personal setup that she'd built over years of tinkering and learning. Ham radio gear, scanners, frequency analyzers, all perfectly legal for civilian use. The tools that had made her so good at her job, and ultimately, the tools that had cost her that job. As she wrapped the equipment carefully in bubble wrap, Sarah thought about her father, Master Sergeant Ricardo Martinez, who'd served 3 tours in Vietnam and had instilled in her both a love of country and an unshakable moral compass. He'd been gone for 5 years now, but she could still hear his voice. Mija, doing the right thing isn't always easy, and it's not always rewarded, but it's always right. The thunder started around midnight. Not the gentle rumble of a distant storm, but the sharp crack of lightning striking close. Sarah stood at her window, watching the light show illuminate the base one last time. In less than 48 hours, she'd be a civilian, looking for work in a field where her specialized skills might not translate easily to the private sector. Her phone buzzed with text messages from colleagues who'd heard the news. Some offered support. Others expressed anger at what they saw as her stubborn refusal to bend. A few simply said they'd miss her. She didn't reply to any of them. What was there to say? The next morning brought a steady stream of visitors to her apartment. Fellow communications specialists stopped by to say goodbye, to shake their heads at what they saw as a waste of talent. Master Sergeant Coleman, her former supervisor and mentor, arrived around noon with a cardboard carrier of coffee and a grim expression. "This is bullshit, Martinez, and you know it," he said without preamble, setting the coffee on her kitchen counter. "Half the lives you saved over the years, and they're throwing you out for trying to save more." Sarah poured herself a cup and inhaled the familiar aroma. Military coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Rules are rules, Top. Harrison made that clear. Rules are guidelines, Coleman corrected. And sometimes guidelines need to be ignored when people's lives are at stake. You did the right thing. Tell that to the review board. Coleman was quiet for a moment, studying her face. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. A handheld radio scanner, civilian model, perfectly legal. Consider this a going-away present. Just because you're leaving the Air Force doesn't mean you stop caring about people in trouble. Sarah took the scanner, surprised by how heavy it felt in her hands. "Top, I can't. If they find out you gave me this, they won't find out because you're not going to tell them. Besides," he grinned, "what are they going to do? Court-martial me?" That evening, Sarah loaded the last of her boxes into her 10-year-old Honda Civic. Everything she owned in the world fit in the back of a compact car. The apartment she'd called home for 5 years was now just another empty unit waiting for the next assignment. She drove through the base gate one final time, returning the salute of the security guard who'd checked her ID thousands of times over the years. In her rearview mirror, she watched the lights of the installation grow smaller until they disappeared entirely. The cheap motel 20 miles from base wasn't much to look at, but it was what she could afford while she figured out her next move. The room smelled of industrial disinfectant and other people's disappointments. The bed was lumpy, the air conditioner rattled, and the TV only got 3 channels clearly. But it was quiet, and quiet was what Sarah needed to think. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out her laptop, scrolling through job postings for communications technicians, network administrators, anything that might use her skills. The pay was decent, but nothing came close to matching the sense of purpose she'd felt in the military. Around 11 p.m., she unpacked Coleman's scanner and turned it on, more out of habit than any real interest. The familiar static filled the small room as she slowly moved through frequencies. Police dispatch, fire department, emergency medical services. All the voices of people trying to help other people in their worst moments. She was about to turn it off when she heard something that made her freeze. A weak signal on a frequency that wasn't supposed to be in use. A voice distorted by static and distance but unmistakably human. Someone was calling for help. Sarah grabbed a pencil and paper, jotting down what she could make out. Coordinates that put the signal somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. An aircraft call sign she didn't recognize. And then, clearest of all, the words that would change everything. Emergency, emergency. This is Flight 847. We have lost all navigation and communications. If anyone can hear this, we need help. The signal faded before she could respond, lost in the static and interference. But Sarah was already moving, her fingers flying over the scanner's controls as she tried to reacquire the frequency. In that moment, sitting in a cheap motel room with her career in ruins, she realized that everything she'd been through had been preparing her for this. The thunder outside seemed to agree, rolling across the sky like nature's own applause. Sarah Martinez might no longer be a technical sergeant in the United States Air Force, but she was still someone who answered when people called for help. And Flight 847 was definitely calling for help. The weak signal crackled through the cheap motel room like a ghost trying to speak. Sarah hunched over the scanner, adjusting the squelch and frequency with the precision of a surgeon, her fingers moving across controls she knew by muscle memory. Outside, the storm was intensifying, but inside the cramped room, all of her attention was focused on that fragile thread of communication coming from somewhere high above the Pacific Ocean. Flight 847, this is Sarah Martinez, she said into her handheld radio, hoping against hope that someone would hear her. The silence that followed was deafening. She tried again, adjusting her power settings and antenna positioning. Nothing but static. But she knew what she'd heard. An aircraft in distress, using a frequency that shouldn't have been active. Emergency protocols that weren't being followed. A situation that was probably already spiraling beyond official control, while bureaucrats argued about jurisdictions and proper channels. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began cross-referencing flight data. Flight 847 wasn't showing up in any commercial airline databases. Not American, not United, not Delta. She expanded her search to cargo carriers, private jets, international flights. Still nothing. Whatever was up there, it was either using a false identifier or flying completely off the grid. The thunder crashed again, so close that the motel room's windows rattled. Lightning illuminated the parking lot in stark white flashes that turned raindrops into silver needles. Sarah barely noticed. She was deep in the zone now, that focus state she'd learned to reach during her years in Air Force communications. Everything else faded away except the problem that needed solving. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister, Elena. "Hey, heard about what happened. Mum's worried sick. Call me." Sarah silenced the phone without reading further. She'd deal with family explanations later. Right now, 347 people might be flying blind through one of the worst storm systems she'd seen in years. The number had come from her quick research. Flight 847 was actually Pacific International Airways Flight 847, a Boeing 777 that had departed Manila 6 hours ago bound for Los Angeles International Airport. The fact that it wasn't showing up in official tracking systems meant something had gone seriously wrong with their transponder and communication systems. Sarah pulled up weather data and felt her stomach drop. The storm system stretching across their flight path was massive, with cloud tops reaching nearly 50,000 feet and lightning activity that would interfere with any electronic navigation systems. Wind shear that could tear an aircraft apart. Turbulence that would make experienced pilots sick. And, somewhere in the middle of that chaos, 347 people were flying blind. She tried the radio again, cycling through related frequencies that military aircraft might use for backup communications. Flight 847, this is Sarah Martinez on emergency frequency. Do you copy? Static. Thunder. The sound of rain hammering against the motel window. Then, faint as a whisper, Sarah Martinez. This is Captain James Rodriguez, Pacific International 847. Thank God someone's answering. The relief in the pilot's voice was palpable, even through the interference. Sarah grabbed her notebook and pen, her heart racing. Captain Rodriguez, I copy you 5x5. What's your situation? We've lost all primary navigation systems. GPS is down, compass is spinning, and we can't raise anyone on standard frequencies. We're flying on backup instruments only, and they're giving us conflicting information. The storm has us completely disoriented. Sarah's military training kicked in automatically. First priority, establish reliable communications. Second priority, determine exact position. Third priority, provide navigation assistance. Captain, I need you to give me your last known position and any landmarks you might be able to identify. The radio crackled with interference as Rodriguez conferred with his crew. Sarah could hear other voices in the background, the controlled urgency of professionals dealing with a crisis. Last GPS reading was approximately 800 nautical miles southwest of Los Angeles. But that was over an hour ago, and we've been flying through severe turbulence. Could be anywhere within a 100-mile radius of that position. Sarah was already pulling up nautical charts on her laptop, cross-referencing the coordinates with current weather patterns. The picture that emerged wasn't good. The aircraft was right in the heart of the storm system, with severe weather extending in all directions. Standard air traffic control would have vectors to get them out safely, but if they couldn't communicate with ATC... Captain, are you receiving any other aircraft or ground control transmissions? Negative. You're the first voice we've heard in over 2 hours. Our passengers are starting to panic, and honestly, so is some of my crew. We need guidance, and we need it fast. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a familiar burden. She'd been in this position before, serving as the link between aircrew and crisis, and the resources that could save them. But this time, she didn't have the backing of the United States Air Force. She didn't have access to military radar systems or direct communication with air traffic control centers. She was one person in a motel room with a handheld radio and whatever equipment she could improvise. It would have to be enough. Captain Rodriguez, I understand your situation. I'm a former Air Force communications specialist, and I'm going to help you get through this. But I need you to follow my instructions exactly. Can you do that? Affirmative. At this point, you're our lifeline. Sarah took a deep breath and began the process that would consume the next 6 hours of her life. First, she needed to establish the aircraft's exact position. Without GPS, she'd have to rely on old-fashioned radio navigation techniques that most modern pilots had never needed to use. Captain, I need you to tune your number 2 radio to frequency 348.6. That's a VOR navigation beacon that should still be transmitting from Point Conception in California. Tell me what bearing you're receiving. The minutes stretched as the crew complied. Sarah could hear the tension in their voices as they struggled with equipment they rarely used, reading instruments that most pilots relied on computers to interpret. Finally, Rodriguez came back. We're showing a bearing of 045 degrees from Point Conception. Sarah marked the bearing on her chart and continued the process with other navigation beacons. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to triangulate the aircraft's position. They were further north than Rodriguez had estimated, and dangerously close to a mountain range that would be invisible in the storm. Captain, you need to turn to heading 180 and begin an immediate descent to 25,000 feet. You're currently on a collision course with terrain. Are you sure? Our instruments are showing clear air ahead. Your instruments are wrong. The storm is interfering with your radar. Turn now. There was a pause that lasted forever. Sarah could almost feel the pilot's hesitation, the weight of deciding whether to trust a stranger's voice over his own equipment. Finally, turning to 180, beginning descent. The radio went quiet except for static as the crew focused on the dangerous maneuver. Sarah used the time to make calculations, plotting courses that would take them around the worst of the weather. Her laptop screen showed a maze of storm cells, wind patterns, and air traffic corridors. Finding a safe path would require threading a needle while flying blind. When Rodriguez came back, he sounded shaken. Sarah, we just passed through some serious turbulence. Whatever you had us avoid up there, I don't want to think about what would have happened if we'd hit it. Don't think about it, Sarah replied. Just focus on flying. I'm working on a route to get you out of this mess. But even as she said it, she knew the situation was deteriorating. The storm was expanding, moving faster than weather services had predicted. Safe corridors were closing as rapidly as she could identify them. And Flight 847's fuel situation was becoming critical. Captain, I need a fuel status report. The pause before Rodriguez answered told her everything she needed to know. We've got maybe 3 hours of flying time left, but that's assuming normal consumption. This storm is forcing us to use a lot more power than usual. 3 hours? Sarah stared at her charts and felt the walls closing in. In perfect conditions, the aircraft needed at least 4 hours to reach the nearest airport with suitable runway facilities. And conditions were anything but perfect. Her phone rang suddenly, jarring her from the calculations. The caller ID showed a number she recognized. Master Sergeant Coleman from the base. Against her better judgment, she answered, Martinez, what the hell do you think you're doing? Coleman's voice was tight with worry. I just got word that someone's been transmitting on military emergency frequencies from your location. Top, I can't explain right now, but there's an aircraft in trouble, and I'm the only one who can reach them. Sarah, listen to me. You're a civilian now. You have no authority to handle aircraft emergencies. If the Air Force finds out, the Air Force already threw me out, Sarah interrupted. And right now, that aircraft has 347 people on board who don't care about my authority. They just need help. Coleman was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. What do you need? The simple question caught Sarah off guard. She'd expected orders to stop, threats about civilian interference with military operations, warnings about legal consequences. Instead, Coleman was offering to help. I need access to military radar coverage for the Pacific sector. These people are flying blind, and I can only do so much with civilian navigation aids. That's not possible, and you know it. But Coleman paused. What if someone were to accidentally leave a radar terminal logged in at the communications center? And what if the security cameras in that area happened to malfunction for a few hours? Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Even after everything that had happened, there were still people willing to bend the rules to save lives. Top, if they catch you, let me worry about that. You just focus on getting those people on the ground safely. I'll call you back in 10 minutes with access codes. The line went dead, leaving Sarah alone with the storm and the static. Outside, the thunder seemed to be getting closer, as if the weather was following Flight 847's distress signal. She looked at her laptop screen, at the maze of red and yellow weather patterns that represented death and turbulence for anyone caught in their path. Flight 847 was still out there, still flying blind through conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. Sarah had managed to identify their position and guide them away from immediate terrain threats, but they were still hours from safety and running low on fuel. The radio crackled. Sarah, this is Captain Rodriguez. We're picking up some kind of interference on our communications. Are you still there? I'm here, Captain. What kind of interference? It sounds like someone's trying to jam our frequency. We're starting to lose you. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. Someone was actively interfering with the emergency communications. Whether it was atmospheric conditions or deliberate jamming, the result was the same. Flight 847 was about to lose their only lifeline to the ground. She grabbed her equipment and began setting up backup systems. Multiple radios tuned to different frequencies. If someone wanted to cut off communications with that aircraft, they'd have to work for it, because Sarah Martinez might be a former Air Force communications specialist, but she was still someone who answered when people called for help. And Flight 847 was still calling. The interference hit like a wall of white noise, drowning out Flight 847's transmissions in a cascade of electronic static. Sarah watched the signal strength meters on her equipment drop to almost nothing, as whatever was jamming the frequency grew stronger. In her earpiece, Captain Rodriguez's voice faded to whispers between bursts of harsh interference. Sarah, can barely hear you. Losing. Then nothing but static. Sarah's hands moved frantically across her radio controls, jumping between frequencies, adjusting power levels, trying everything she'd learnt in 5 years of military communications training. The jamming was sophisticated, tracking her frequency changes and adapting almost instantly. This wasn't atmospheric interference from the storm. Someone was deliberately cutting off communications with that aircraft. Her phone buzzed with a text from Coleman. Radar access in 60 seconds. Package arriving at your door now. Before Sarah could process what he meant, there was a sharp knock at her motel room door. She peered through the peephole and saw a young airman in civilian clothes, carrying a large duffel bag and looking nervous as hell. Senior Airman Jackson, ma'am, the young man said when she opened the door. Master Sergeant Coleman sent me with some equipment he thought you might need. Sarah pulled him inside quickly, closing the door behind him. Jackson unzipped the duffel bag to reveal military-grade communication equipment, a high-powered transceiver, frequency-hopping radios, signal amplifiers, and a portable satellite uplink system that definitely wasn't supposed to leave the base. Ma'am, the Master Sergeant said to tell you that this gear has a 12-hour battery life and can punch through just about any interference you're likely to encounter. He also said to tell you that officially, this equipment was signed out for a training exercise that doesn't exist. Sarah looked at the sophisticated equipment and felt a surge of gratitude mixed with guilt. Coleman and Jackson were risking their careers to help her, just as she had risked hers to save the passengers on that downed aircraft 3 weeks ago. The pattern was becoming clear. Sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules, and sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to save lives. Jackson, you need to leave now, he said firmly. The less you know about what happens next, the better. The airman nodded and headed for the door, then paused. Ma'am? My sister flies commercial airlines a lot. Whatever you're doing, thank you. As soon as Jackson left, Sarah began setting up the military equipment. The high-powered transceiver was designed to maintain communications even in electronic warfare environments, using frequency-hopping technology that made jamming nearly impossible. Within minutes, she had it calibrated and ready. Flight 847, this is Sarah Martinez on alternate frequency. Do you copy? The response came through clearly, cutting through the interference like a knife. Sarah, thank God. We thought we'd lost you completely. What happened to our communications? Someone's jamming your primary frequency, Captain. We're now on a military emergency channel that should be secure from interference. What's your current status? We're still in the middle of this storm system, running low on fuel, and my passengers are getting increasingly panicked. The flight attendants are doing their best, but word is spreading that we're in serious trouble. Sarah's laptop chimed with an incoming message from Coleman. Radar access codes and login credentials for the military air traffic control system. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she logged in, and suddenly, her screen filled with real-time radar coverage of the entire Pacific region. The picture that emerged made her blood run cold. Flight 847 showed up as a single blip surrounded by massive storm cells that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the other aircraft she could see on the radar. Military jets flying in patterns that suggested they were searching for something. Or hunting something. Sarah grabbed her secure radio and tried to contact the Air Force Emergency Operations Center. Using protocols she technically no longer had clearance to access. The duty officer who answered sounded harried. This is Major Peterson, Emergency Ops. Who is this and how did you get this frequency? Major, this is former Technical Sergeant Martinez. I'm in communication with Pacific International Flight 847, which is currently lost in severe weather approximately 600 nautical miles southwest of Los Angeles. They need immediate assistance. There was a long pause. Martinez? The Martinez who was discharged yesterday for insubordination? That's irrelevant right now, Major. This aircraft has 347 souls on board, and they're running out of time and fuel. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to cease all communications immediately. This situation is being handled through official channels. What official channels? This aircraft can't communicate with anyone except me. They've been flying blind for 3 hours. Another pause. Sarah could hear voices in the background, urgent conversations she couldn't quite make out. When Major Peterson came back on the line, his voice was cold. Ma'am, you are interfering with an ongoing military operation. Cease all transmissions immediately, or you will face federal charges. The connection went dead. Sarah stared at the radio in disbelief. Military operation? What kind of military operation involved letting a civilian airliner disappear in a storm? Unless... Her mind raced through possibilities. Pacific International was a small carrier that flew routes between Asia and the United States. What if Flight 847 was carrying something or someone that certain people didn't want to reach American soil? What if the communication breakdown wasn't an accident but part of a deliberate plan to make the aircraft disappear? The radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice. Sarah, we're showing multiple aircraft on our radar now. Military aircraft. They're not responding to our transmissions, but they're definitely tracking us. Sarah looked at her radar screen and saw the same thing. 6 F-16 Fighting Falcons, arranged in a loose formation around the civilian aircraft, close enough to observe, but far enough away to avoid the worst of the turbulence. They were escorting Flight 847, but to where? Captain, I need you to listen to me very carefully, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. I believe your aircraft may have been deliberately isolated from normal air traffic control. The military jets around you are not there for rescue purposes. What are you saying? I'm saying that someone very powerful wants your flight to disappear, and they're using the storm as cover. The communication jamming, the radar blackout, the lack of search and rescue operations, it's all too coordinated to be a coincidence. Rodriguez was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was tense. Sarah, I need to tell you something. We're not just carrying passengers on this flight. We have a special cargo container in the forward hold, diplomatic cargo that was loaded in Manila under heavy security. I wasn't told what was in it, but the security protocols were unlike anything I've seen in 20 years of flying. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. Flight 847 wasn't just a civilian airliner caught in a storm. It was carrying something valuable enough to kill 347 people to keep it from reaching the United States. The communication breakdown, the jamming, the military escort, it was all designed to make the aircraft disappear without a trace. But they hadn't counted on Sarah Martinez sitting in a cheap motel room with military equipment and a stubborn refusal to let innocent people die. "Captain, how much fuel do you have left?" "Maybe 90 minutes at current consumption. Less if we have to continue fighting this turbulence." Sarah studied the radar screen, looking for options. The storm system was huge, but it wasn't impenetrable. There were gaps, corridors of relatively calm air that a skilled pilot could navigate. But they were narrow and constantly shifting, requiring precise timing and navigation. More importantly, she could see something the military jets couldn't: a small civilian airport on the California coast that showed up on her charts but wasn't appearing on standard radar systems. Probably because it was privately owned and operated below the official flight tracking network. "Captain, I'm going to give you vectors to a small airport that might be off the official grid. It's a risk, but it's better than letting those military aircraft guide you to wherever they're planning to take you. Are you sure about this? If I'm wrong, you crash at a small airport instead of disappearing forever over the Pacific Ocean." "I'll take those odds." Sarah began feeding Rodriguez headings and altitude changes, using her access to military radar to thread Flight 847 through the gaps in the storm system. It was like performing surgery while blindfolded, requiring split-second timing and absolute trust between pilot and ground controller. The military jets followed, maintaining their formation but clearly confused by the civilian aircraft's sudden changing course. Sarah could hear radio chatter on military frequencies as the pilots tried to figure out what was happening. "Unknown aircraft providing navigation to civilian flight. Identify yourself immediately," came a voice on the military emergency frequency. Sarah keyed her microphone. "This is a private citizen providing emergency assistance to an aircraft in distress. Flight 847 is exercising their right to emergency navigation under international aviation law. You are interfering with a classified military operation. Cease assistance immediately." "Negative. These people have a right to survive." The next transmission came with ice in the voice. "Ma'am, you have been identified and your location is known. Federal agents are en route to your position. This is your final warning." Sarah looked out the motel window and saw black SUVs pulling into the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the rain like searchlights. Men in dark suits were already getting out, moving with the purposeful stride of people who were used to getting their way. She had maybe 2 minutes before they reached her door. "Captain Rodriguez, listen carefully. I'm about to lose communications. In 60 seconds, turn to heading 095 and begin descent to 15,000 feet. There's an airport 15 miles ahead with a runway long enough for your aircraft. The identifier is K47G. It's not on standard charts, but it's there." "Sarah, what's happening?" The pounding on the motel room door was like thunder. "Federal agents, open the door immediately." Sarah grabbed the most critical piece of equipment, the handheld radio with the secure frequency, and headed for the bathroom window. It was small, but she was smaller. Years of military physical training had kept her in shape for moments exactly like this. "Captain, I'm signing off now. Follow those vectors, trust your instruments, and get those people on the ground safely. Good luck." She clicked off the radio just as the motel room door burst open behind her. Through the bathroom window, she could see the storm continuing to rage across the sky, lightning illuminating the clouds where Flight 847 was still fighting for survival. Sarah Martinez might be about to become a federal fugitive, but 347 people were going to have a chance to live because she'd refused to follow orders one more time. The window was small, and the drop to the ground was farther than she'd hoped. But she'd made her choice weeks ago, when she'd first decided that saving lives mattered more than following rules. Now she just had to hope that Flight 847's pilots were as good as they claimed to be. Sarah dropped through the bathroom window into the storm, landing hard on the rain-soaked asphalt behind the motel. Above her, she could hear federal agents ransacking her room, shouting orders and demanding information she was no longer there to provide. The handheld radio crackled in her grip as she scrambled toward the tree line that bordered the motel property. Lightning illuminated her path in stark white flashes as she ran through the downpour. Behind her, she could hear car doors slamming and voices coordinating a search. They would find her trail soon enough, but she didn't need much time. Just enough to guide Flight 847 through the final approach to that small airport she'd identified. She found shelter behind a large pine tree and keyed the radio. "Captain Rodriguez, this is Sarah. Do you copy?" Static answered her for several heart-stopping seconds. Then, Sarah. We thought we'd lost you. We're following your vectors, but visibility is near zero, and the turbulence is getting worse. Sarah pulled up the weather radar on her phone, studying the storm patterns around the small coastal airport. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had been a narrow corridor of relatively calm air was closing as the storm system continued to expand and intensify. Captain, I need you to increase your rate of descent to 2,000 feet per minute. I know that's faster than standard procedures, but you need to get below the worst of the turbulence before it gets any worse. Copy that. Beginning rapid descent. Through the rain, Sarah could see flashlight beams sweeping the area around the motel as the federal agents expanded their search. She moved deeper into the woods, using skills learned during survival training to minimize her trail, but she knew they'd find her eventually. The radio transmissions could be triangulated, and she was on foot while they had vehicles and probably helicopters on the way. Sarah, we're getting some kind of warning signal from the military aircraft. Rodriguez's voice was tight with stress. They're trying to force us to change course. Sarah looked at her phone's display and felt her blood run cold. The F-16s had moved into an intercept formation, boxing in the civilian aircraft and clearly preparing to force it away from the coastal airport. If Flight 847 complied, they'd be guided back out over the ocean where they could disappear without witnesses. Captain, do not alter your course. Those aircraft have no legal authority to force you to do anything. You're in international airspace with an aircraft in distress. Emergency protocols supersede military operations. They're not giving us much choice. One of them just buzzed our cockpit close enough to rattle the windows. The situation was escalating beyond anything Sarah had imagined. Military aircraft were actively threatening a civilian airliner to prevent it from landing safely. Whatever was in that diplomatic cargo container, someone was willing to commit mass murder to keep it from reaching American soil. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Coleman's number, she answered quickly. Top, I can't talk long. Federal agents are hunting me, and I'm trying to guide an aircraft through an emergency landing. Sarah, listen to me. I've been monitoring military communications, and this goes higher than we thought. The order to intercept that flight came directly from the Pentagon. Someone with serious influence wants that aircraft to disappear. Any idea what they're carrying? Negative, but whatever it is, it's worth killing 347 innocent people to keep it secret. There's something else. They're bringing in attack helicopters to your area. You need to get out of there now. Sarah looked up through the rain and could already hear the distant whoop 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 of rotors approaching. In the distance, searchlights were beginning to sweep the forest. Soon, she'd have nowhere to run. Top, I need one more favor. Can you patch me through to the news media? If this goes public, they can't make that aircraft disappear without answering some very difficult questions. Already on it. I've got contacts at 3 major networks who are standing by for your call. But Sarah, once you do this, there's no going back. You'll be wanted for treason, espionage, interfering with national security operations. I'm already wanted for helping people survive. Might as well make it count. Sarah gave Coleman the phone number for a disposable cell phone she bought months ago and never used. Within minutes, she was connected to Jessica Chen, an investigative reporter for CNN who specialized in military cover-ups and government corruption. Ms. Martinez, Master Sergeant Coleman has briefed me on the situation. Are you certain about what you're telling me? A civilian airliner being threatened by U.S. military aircraft?
Mrs.
Chen, in about 10 minutes, Flight 847 is going to attempt an emergency landing at a small airport in California. They're carrying 347 passengers and crew, plus some kind of diplomatic cargo that apparently someone is willing to kill for. If you can get news helicopters to that airport, you can document whatever's about to happen. What airport?
Sarah gave her the coordinates for the small coastal facility.
It's called Seacliff Regional. Private airstrip, but it's got a runway long enough for a 777 if the pilot's good enough. We'll have crews there in 20 minutes. Ms. Martinez, are you safe? The sound of helicopters was getting closer, and Sarah could see flashlight beams moving through the trees toward her position. That remains to be seen. She ended the call and switched back to the aircraft frequency. Captain Rodriguez, status report. We're 5 miles out from the airport, but the military aircraft are getting more aggressive. They're flying close enough to create wake turbulence, trying to force us off course. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to think. The F-16s could easily force Flight 847 to crash by creating dangerous flight conditions, then claim it was an accident caused by the storm. Unless... Captain, I need you to do something that's going to sound crazy. When I give you the signal, I want you to declare a full emergency over the international distress frequency. Broadcast in the clear, no encryption, maximum power. Tell everyone listening that you're being attacked by unmarked military aircraft. That could be considered an act of war. Right now, those aircraft are committing an act of war against civilian passengers. Fight back with the truth. The helicopters were almost overhead now, their searchlights beginning to penetrate the forest canopy. Sarah crawled deeper into a thicket of brambles, ignoring the thorns that tore at her clothes and skin. The radio was her lifeline to Flight 847, and she'd protect that connection until her last breath. Sarah, we can see the airport lights ahead. Runway looks clear, but the approach is going to be rough in this weather. You can do this, Captain. I've seen military pilots land in worse conditions. The difference is, they weren't being harassed by fighter jets while trying to save 347 lives. That's when Sarah heard something that made her heart skip. The sound of news helicopters approaching from the south. Jessica Chen had been as good as her word, and media aircraft were converging on Seacliff Regional Airport. Suddenly, whatever was about to happen would have witnesses. Captain, you've got news media inbound to the airport. Whatever happens next is going to be recorded and broadcast live. The military aircraft can't afford to do anything too obvious now. As if responding to her words, the F-16 suddenly broke off their aggressive positioning and pulled back to a more respectful distance. The power of public scrutiny was already working. Beginning final approach, Rodriguez announced, his voice steady despite everything they'd been through. Runway in sight, gear down, flaps configured for landing. Sarah held her breath as she listened to the aircraft make its final approach. Through her earpiece, she could hear the controlled chaos of a cockpit during an emergency landing, altitude call-outs, airspeed checks, the quiet professionalism of a crew doing their jobs under impossible conditions. Then, cutting through all of it, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world. The screech of tires on wet asphalt. We're down. Flight 847 is on the ground safely. Sarah felt tears mixing with rainwater on her face as relief washed over her. They'd done it. Against all odds, despite military interference and federal pursuit, 347 people were alive and safe on the ground. But her celebration was short-lived. The searchlights found her hiding spot, and she was suddenly blinded by white light as helicopters descended around her position. Armed federal agents repelled from the aircraft, surrounding her with weapons drawn. Sarah Martinez, you are under arrest for interference with federal operations, violation of national security protocols, and treason against the United States of America. Sarah raised her hand slowly, the radio still clutched in her grip. As the agents moved in to arrest her, she keyed the microphone one final time. Captain Rodriguez, this is Sarah, signing off. Get those passengers to safety and make sure the world knows what happened here tonight. The radio was torn from her hands as zip ties were applied to her wrists. As they dragged her toward a waiting helicopter, Sarah looked up at the storm clouds and smiled. Up there, Flight 847 was taxiing to the terminal where 347 people would soon be reunited with their families. Down here, news cameras were already documenting every moment of her arrest. The cover-up was blown, the conspiracy was exposed, and whatever secrets were hidden in that diplomatic cargo container would soon be front-page news around the world. Sarah Martinez had lost her military career for refusing to follow orders. Now she might lose her freedom for the same reason, but as she was loaded into the federal helicopter, she knew she'd made the right choice. Some things were more important than following orders. Some things were worth sacrificing everything to protect, like 347 people who were going home to their families because one stubborn communication specialist had refused to let them disappear into the storm. The helicopter lifted off into the rain, carrying Sarah toward an uncertain future. But behind them, at a small coastal airport, Flight 847's passengers were walking downstairs onto American soil, alive and free, because sometimes the right thing to do was exactly the wrong thing to do, according to the rules, and sometimes that was the only thing that mattered. The federal detention facility in downtown Los Angeles was a sterile monument to bureaucratic power, all concrete walls and fluorescent lighting that made everything look sickly and pale. Sarah sat in a windowless interrogation room for the third day running, her wrists chafed from handcuffs and her spirit worn down by endless questions from federal prosecutors who seemed more interested in making her disappear than understanding what she'd actually done. Agent Patricia Hawkins sat across from her, a stern woman in her 40s whose grey suit matched her grey hair and grey personality. For 72 hours, she'd been trying to get Sarah to admit to crimes that ranged from treason to terrorism, charges that carried life sentences, or worse. Ms. 10 Martinez Let me be clear about your situation, Hawkins said, consulting a thick folder marked classified. You interfered with a legitimate federal operation. You used stolen military equipment to communicate with an aircraft carrying sensitive diplomatic materials. You compromised ongoing national security investigations. And you did all of this while broadcasting details to international news media. Sarah looked up from the metal table where her hands were cuffed. She was tired, hungry, and probably facing decades in federal prison. But her conscience was clear. Agent Hawkins, I helped save 347 innocent lives. If that's treason, then I'm guilty as charged. Those people were never in any real danger. The aircraft would have been safely escorted to a secure facility for processing. After flying around for hours burning fuel they didn't have, in weather conditions that were getting worse by the minute. How many of those 347 people would have survived your safe escort to nowhere? Hawkins' jaw tightened. This was an argument they'd been having for 3 days, and neither side was willing to budge. But something had changed in the last few hours. The agent seemed less confident, more defensive, and she kept glancing at her phone as if waiting for important news. The door opened and a man in an expensive suit entered, followed by someone Sarah recognized, Jessica Chen, the CNN reporter she'd contacted during the crisis. Behind them came another familiar figure that made Sarah's heart leap, Master Sergeant Coleman, looking uncomfortable in civilian clothes but determined. Agent Hawkins, the man in the suit, said, I'm David Brennan, Miss Hay, Martinez's attorney. These proceedings are terminated immediately. Hawkins stood up quickly. You have no authority here, Counselor. This is a federal investigation involving matters of national security. Brennan smiled and pulled out a folder of his own. Actually, I have several authorities. First, a federal judge has ruled that Ms. Martinez's detention without formal charges violates her constitutional rights. Second, the State Department has classified the contents of Flight 847's cargo container, and what they found changes everything about this case. Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with curiosity. What was in the container? Jessica Chen stepped forward, her notebook already out. Ms. Martinez, what was in that container was evidence of systematic human trafficking operations being run through diplomatic channels. Passports, financial records, shipping manifests documenting the movement of hundreds of victims across international borders. Someone very powerful was using diplomatic immunity to run a slave trade, and they were willing to kill an entire aircraft full of people to keep that evidence from reaching federal investigators. The room went silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Sarah stared at the reporter, processing the implications. The military aircraft, the communication jamming, the desperate attempts to make Flight 847 disappear, it all made sense now. They hadn't been trying to protect national security, they'd been trying to protect criminals. Coleman stepped forward and placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. There's more, Martinez. The investigation has already led to arrests at the highest levels of government. The Secretary of Transportation, 3 Pentagon officials, and the head of a major shipping corporation. Your actions didn't just save those passengers, you exposed a criminal conspiracy that stretched from Manila to Washington, D.C. Agent Hawkins looked like someone had just told her that everything she'd believed was wrong, which Sarah realized was probably exactly what had happened. I was told this was a matter of national security. You were lied to, Brennan said firmly, just like the pilots of those F-16s were lied to. Just like everyone involved in this operation, except the people at the very top who were trying to cover up their crimes. Sarah felt the handcuffs being removed from her wrists as the reality of the situation sank in. She wasn't a traitor or a terrorist. She was a whistleblower who had stumbled onto something much bigger than anyone had realized. Ms. Martinez, Jessica Chen said, I'd like to do a full interview with you about what happened. The American people deserve to know how one person's courage exposed a conspiracy that their own government was trying to hide. But Sarah was looking at Coleman, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Top, what about you and Jackson? Are you facing charges for helping me? Coleman grinned. Funny thing about breaking the rules to expose corruption, turns out it's called being a patriot, not a criminal. Jackson's been promoted, and I've been asked to head up a new task force investigating military communication security. Seems like people finally figured out that sometimes the rules need to be broken to serve the greater good. Over the next several hours, Sarah learned the full scope of what they had uncovered. The diplomatic cargo on Flight 847 contained evidence of a trafficking network that had moved over 2,000 victims in the past 5 years, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal profits. High-ranking officials in multiple governments had been bought off to look the other way, and the entire operation had been hidden behind the veil of diplomatic immunity. Captain Rodriguez and his crew had been detained for 3 days, but they were now being hailed as heroes for their skill in landing the aircraft under impossible conditions. The passengers had been questioned extensively, but most had no idea they had been flying with evidence of one of the largest criminal conspiracies in modern history. The military pilots who had harassed Flight 847 were also cleared of wrongdoing. They had been given orders they believed came from legitimate national security operations. The real criminals were the people who had given those orders, people who were now facing life sentences for conspiracy, murder, and treason. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing in the rose garden of the White House, wearing a borrowed dress and feeling completely out of place among the politicians and dignitaries who had gathered for what the president called a ceremony honoring American heroes who chose conscience over convenience. President Anderson, a tall woman with silver hair and a reputation for straight talk, approached the podium with a medal case in her hands. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to honor someone who demonstrated that doing the right thing sometimes means breaking the wrong rules. Former Technical Sergeant Sarah Martinez risked her career, her freedom, and her life to save 347 innocent people and expose a criminal conspiracy that reached the highest levels of our government. Sarah tried to focus on the president's words, but her mind kept drifting to that night in the motel room when she'd first heard Flight 847's distress call. She thought about the choice she'd made to answer, even when it meant violating her discharge terms and risking federal prosecution. The medal I am about to present, the president continued, is the Presidential Medal of Freedom, our nation's highest civilian honor. It is given to individuals who have made especially meritorious contributions to the security or national interests of the United States, to world peace, or to cultural or other significant public or private endeavors. As the medal was placed around her neck, Sarah thought about her father, Master Sergeant Ricardo Martinez, who had taught her that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, but was always right. She thought about the 347 passengers who had gone home to their families because she'd refused to follow orders that would have let them die. After the ceremony, as reporters shouted questions and photographers captured every moment, Sarah found herself in a quiet corner of the garden with Coleman and Jessica Chen. "So what's next?" Chen asked. "You've been offered jobs by 3 different federal agencies, 2 major corporations, and at least 4 news networks that I know of." Sarah looked up at the sky, thinking about radio waves traveling invisible paths through the atmosphere, carrying voices of people who needed help to those willing to listen. "I've been thinking about starting a non-profit organization, emergency communication services for aircraft and ships that find themselves outside normal rescue channels. Officially sanctioned, properly funded, completely legal." Coleman laughed. "Leave it to you to turn getting arrested for breaking the rules into a new way to help people." "Someone once told me that rules are guidelines," Sarah replied. "And sometimes guidelines need to be ignored when people's lives are at stake." 6 months later, the Martinez Emergency Communications Foundation was operational, staffed by retired military communications specialists and funded by donations from grateful families whose loved ones had been saved by amateur radio operators and emergency volunteers around the world. They operated from a small building outside Los Angeles, equipped with the most advanced communication equipment available. Sarah stood in the main operations center, watching her team monitor emergency frequencies around the clock. On the wall was a framed photo from Flight 847's reunion dinner, showing all 347 passengers and crew members who had survived that night in the storm. In the center of the photo, Captain Rodriguez held a small plaque that read, "To Sarah Martinez, who answered when we called." The radio on her desk crackled with a weak signal, someone calling for help from somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico.